Hi, and welcome to another session of the Children's Book Mastery Summit. My name is Karen Ferreira, and I'm here with Teresa R. Funk, and she is the author of 8 books for adults and children, including the Homefront Heroes series of children's books set in World War II. She also authors the popular blog Bursts of Brilliance for a Creative Life. Check out our website for resources, videos, and recommended reading lists for writers at teresafunk.com, which we'll also have under this video. And in this session, we are going to talk about how to write historical fiction like a pro. Hi, Teresa.
Hello, Karen. It's nice to see you.
Yes, thank you for joining me. I'm excited to learn from you about historical fiction.
Yes, it's my favorite genre.
Oh, awesome. Okay, good. So then my first question is just in brief, what is historical fiction and does it require research?
Well, technically, there's sort of a rule that historical fiction is anything that takes place 50 years before the writing of the book. But it's a little bit fluid, especially with children's literature, because to kids today, the 1990s are ancient history. And took place before they were born. So it's a little fluid in that sense, but mostly historical fiction takes place in the past, and it takes place in sort of a culturally recognizable time period. So, when you go to shop the book around to agents and editors, you're going to find that if you're writing in a recognizable time period like World War II or the Civil Rights era or the American Revolution, for example, in my country, those would be things that would be easier than, say, a book that is somewhat generically set in the 1970s, right? In the early 70s, unless it was tied to like a very specific historical event. So in terms of marketing, it's easier to get a historical fiction book published if it is in sort of a recognizable time period. And then with your question about research, yes, there's lots and lots of research involved in historical fiction writing. In fact, I always joke that we should get paid more than the average writer because of the amount of research we do. It's sort of a second job, and it comes first. It comes before the writing. You do lots of research in lots of ways, and you can't really avoid that. So if you're going to write historical fiction, a piece of you has to love being that detective and that journalist and going out and doing the research.
Okay, nice, fine. So it's not just like you kind of make it up. It's quite factual.
Quite factual. And you can start with the internet. It's a great place to start. I didn't have access to the internet when I started writing in the early 90s. But the internet is not the only thing that you want to rely on. It's a good place to start, but then you definitely want to go to libraries, museums, archives, organizations that are devoted to the preservation of the history of your time period. You want to go to the experts and verify your facts and make sure that you are double checking information, particularly if you find it on the internet. I have a rule that I have to find it in 3 different places, and they all have to be reputable sources. Like it might be a book that was published, or it might be, a website that is with like the World War II National Museum or the Smithsonian, something really established where they're going to be a trustworthy source. So yeah, you can start with the internet, but then you're going to have to do a whole lot of research and some legwork and maybe a research trip and all kinds of things in order to really nail down what you need to know.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting. And then which types of historical events can authors use in their stories?
Well, you can use pretty much anything you want to use. Oftentimes we center our stories around something that's recognizable, particularly with children. A lot of children's authors even will tie their books to things that the kids are learning in their curriculum, because then you're more likely to have the teachers and the librarians take an interest in that book. So that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just a bit of a marketing tip. So, but you can write about anything. You can write about a big experience like a war. You can write about a smaller experience, like let's say a flood that affected a town. But you want to do it in such a way that you're bringing your reader into that time period and feeling really comfortable there. And that comes from your research and from grounding yourself in the time period. And so, yeah, no holds barred in terms of what you write about, but from the standpoint of marketing, if you're choosing a more established event or time period, you're going to have an easier time getting that book published.
That makes a lot of sense. And then you've definitely touched on it, but how exactly would authors do the needed research for their books?
Well, I like to start with, a deep dive into that time period. So if, let's say, with my books, and I was writing about World War II, I bought dozens of books about the war, right? And I knew what my first story was going to be about because it was based on a real person that I had interviewed. So I was able to deep dive into that particular Battle of Wake Island and what happened there. And then more generically, the war itself and what was happening on the home front and sort of the politics of the war. And so you kind of do that deep dive in the beginning where you get a lot of really general information to ground yourself in the time period. And part of the reason you're doing that is to make sure that there's enough research out there for you to create your story. Because some events are obscure enough that it's really hard to find enough research to make your story come to life. So you do that kind of general big research first, and then you plot out your story. And you make sure that it's plausible based on the research that you just did. Now, there's the plotters and there's what's called the pantsers, which are people who write by the seat of their pants. And that's what I do. So I do a really rudimentary outline, just like a paragraph on what would happen in each chapter. Other people will plan out a very, very specific outline and make sure all that information's there. My outlines typically change as I write, as I get to know my character better, or as I find some more interesting research. And so then as you're writing, that's when you're doing the research that's more specific to the scene you're writing. So for example, in my Pearl Harbor story, if she goes to a hula event, now I have to stop and do some research on, what would that hula dance look like and how would it be performed? So you're going to be doing research throughout the writing as well. And then at the end, you're going to go back through the whole book and you're going to double check all your facts. And
Wow.
that's a bit tedious, but it's important, especially in children's literature, because when kids read historical fiction, they believe that they're reading the truth and they believe that they're reading history. And so it's kind of our responsibility to make sure we double check those facts.
Okay, wow, that's very helpful. Thank you. And what are some of the biggest mistakes to avoid when you are writing historical fiction?
Oh, there's a few of them. One is that, people try to cram in all this great information that they found, and it makes the story feel really forced and halting and chunky as it goes along. And so you're going to find a lot of fascinating information. It is not all going to fit into your story, because a story is a pretty simple thing. A story is a character that we care about who wants something, and their want is over here. And your job as the author is to put obstacles in their way to keep them from getting what they want. That's a story. And so once you understand what your character wants, you can kind of look at that research and say, oh, this is such a fascinating tidbit, but it's just not going to fit in to my character's drive. So if you do have that additional research that you love, you can put it on your website, you can put it in the back matter of the book, you can put it all kinds of places, but it probably won't fit into the book. And then another big, common mistake is what we call info dumps. So information dumps. And that would be when you pull the reader out of the story to provide some information that you think they need, but it isn't woven into the story. So maybe it's a paragraph where you explain exactly how that old tractor worked and it stalls the story. Or maybe it's a paragraph where you go into a bunch of backstory. You just dump a bunch of backstory about your character instead of weaving that into your story throughout. Or it could be about the world they're living in. Sometimes there's a temptation with historical fiction to stop the story and say, let me explain to you how this society worked at that time. And that stops your story too. So anything that is halting your story would be an information dump. And you really want to avoid those. And then another mistake would be applying today's standards to an older story. This is super, super tricky right now because, if we're writing a story that takes place in the time of the American Revolution, for example, there's going to be some references to slavery. And how you handle that is pretty delicate because you want to be true to the time period in terms of what your character would experience without, causing kids to question what they're learning now about social justice. So it's a really tricky line to walk. But that's something where if you have beta readers, sensitivity readers, that really comes in handy. People who are reading to help you determine, especially if you're writing about a culture that is not your own, it's really important to have those beta readers and those sensitivity readers that are going to let you know if you are being culturally accurate about, whatever you're writing about. So, yeah, I think those would be my best tips for the challenges of writing historical fiction.
Right, those are really excellent. So that brings me to a side question. I'm definitely familiar with sensitivity readers, but I haven't actually thought of it in terms of for historical fiction. So how would you find sensitivity readers? Because of course, you know, they weren't alive in the 1920s, let's say, if your story happened to be that time. So how would you go about that?
Well, the sensitivity readers are going to help you with the cultural details. So for example, I wrote a story set in a Japanese internment camp. And so I went to some of my friends who were Japanese American or who had had family members who lived in those camps. And I said, you know, they were checking, for example, the Japanese phrases that I used, but they were also checking, you know, would a Japanese parent actually have said that to their American child? And that was where they were helpful in that sense. Now, the time period experts are what it's not a sensitivity reader. That's more of an expert reader or even a beta reader that's really knowledgeable about that time period. But I use lots of experts too. For example, I have an entire scene in my book, V for Victory, that's set in one of the old movie theaters in San Antonio. And I found a guy in San Antonio who'd written a little book about the movie theater. He was an expert on that theater. And so I interviewed him to ask him not only tell me what the theater looked like, but tell me, you know, how did people enter the theater? And did the Black kids have to sit in the upper balcony? They did. So tell me that kind of information that would be specific to the time period. And because he was an expert on that particular theater, that scene really resonates. So people from San Antonio think, how did you know this about this theater in that time? I didn't personally know it. My expert did.
Ah, okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And
Mhm.
so you also mentioned about info dumps and so on, which is, of course, extremely important. So would I be safe to say you're basically doing all the research so you can have an understanding of the world as you would have an understanding of any world in your fiction novel of whichever genre, and that's really it. So that's kind of the world, but then your story isn't about the world, right? It's a normal story about the character and the obstacles, as you were saying. Is that a good kind
Exactly.
of summary?
Yes. And I think it's important to make that distinction that historical fiction is not nonfiction.
Mm.
You can choose to write a nonfiction book for children about this topic, but a historical fiction book is fiction and it's a story. And so you can make up parts of it.
Mm.
You know, you can even change history a little bit if you let the reader know, if you put that in the back matter or in an introduction to the book. People are pretty forgiving of that if you don't try to pass it off as the actual history. So there's a lot of techniques from the fiction writers that we use. We use our five senses. That's really important in historical fiction, because if you're asking a young reader to enter a world that they've never experienced, it's important for them to understand what that world would have smelled like and looked like and felt like. You know, would those lisle stockings they had to wear in the winter be itchy, right? So those five senses are really going to help bring them into that world. And so that's a big part of writing historical fiction is it's a story with a character who has a want, and you might have, you know, secondary storylines with other characters with other wants, and they're intersecting, and your character is going to want more than one thing. You know, for example, they might want to win a writing contest, but what they're really seeking is to provide support for their family. That's like their overall goal. So yeah, all the rules of good fiction writing apply to historical fiction as well.
Perfect. Okay, good. And that goes perfectly into my next question, which is it's obviously set in a different time. So you've gone over quite well over the setting, but if there's something more, but how do you really make sure that your setting and your character and your dialogue is believable, you know, since it's set in a different time?
Super important. One of my pet peeves as a reader, because I read a lot of historical fiction, is when the author goes to all the trouble to get the clothing right, the utensils they use right, the setting right. And then they put dialogue in that sounds like it came out of the modern times. And that pulls me out of the story. I don't like it when that happens. So I'm very careful with my historical fiction that I have dictionaries that tell me when words came into common use. And you can buy dictionaries of American slang that tell you when those words came into common use. You can find, if you're writing about common time periods like World War II, for example, you can find books or lists of common expressions and slang from the 1940s. You can find those on the internet. I have a book that has some of that information. So that's part of how I make my time period sound authentic. And then the other thing would be you look in old Sears catalogs to get an idea for the clothing. Like I have some fashion books from like fashion of the 1920s, and I use those kinds of books to help me dress my characters so that they're authentically dressed. And then, of course, you're looking at old photographs of the town. If there's video, you look at old video of the town and you really study it. You don't just look at it, you study it. You notice what is on those porches that the people are sitting on. You know, what kind of furniture did they have at that time? And even those smallest details can really, really make your story come to life. So local historians are great. If you can, and you can make a research trip to that area, for example, when I was doing my part, which is set in the Illinois Valley, and I went out there and I went to the little tiny museums, and I found a little book for $1 that said, you know, plants of the local area, like what you'd plant in your garden. And there's a victory garden in my story. So I was able to see what kinds of flowers would they have planted in that area with her grandmother when she's planting. So you're not necessarily going to find that easily somewhere else, but a research trip, you can find that in the old bookstores, in the museum gift shops, by talking to the local experts. I often will have a local historian drive me around the town and point things out. So that would be another way to make it really authentic.
Wow. Okay, good. That's really interesting. And then from a cultural viewpoint, like, you mentioned slavery, which is a really good example, but, how men and women might have interacted or how parents were with their children, that kind of thing. Of course, you can do research, but what are some specific things you can do to really get a complete picture of that as well? So you don't have this modern kind of take on, different interactions between races, genders, and all these kind of things.
Yeah. Well, what I do is I read books that were written in that time period. And if possible, I watch movies that were produced in that time period, which I can do with the 1940s. That way you're getting a sense of what the people of that time actually, how they sort of recorded their lives. Newspaper articles, interviews with people who lived at that time. For example, there are a lot of slave interviews that oral histories from former slaves that you can read, and you can see what was their perspective on what happened to them. And so, again, when you're writing about those really sensitive areas, like, for example, the Holocaust or slavery in our country, you do want to be really, really careful that you're being authentic without being jarring to your young reader, or, you want to represent the difficulties of that time without putting kids into such a state that they're going to put that book down, or they're going to misunderstand what you're trying to write, because not all children are reading with the supervision of a parent or a teacher. And so it's a tricky line to walk, and now especially, but I think it's possible, and I think it's important, because historical fiction is the gateway to history for a lot of kids, and it's what gets them interested. And so if you can get them interested in some of the more challenging issues that we've gone through in our history and how it feels to live through that, they're going to take more of an interest in wanting to study it and address it in different ways.
Very true. Okay. And then which other tips could you give authors to write really great historical fiction?
Well, the main tip is, it seems like an obvious one, but it's really not, which is that you need to read current historical fiction. Maybe you loved historical fiction when you were a child. That is not the way books today are written. So a lot of people will come to me and say, well, my favorite books when I was a kid were, and they'll list off these books from 20, 30, 40 years ago. You need to read modern books by award-winning authors to get an idea of not just how do modern authors write about historical fiction, but what's getting published, what's popular and what do kids like to read. And so that's one of the biggest tips. And then a good critique group. My writers group made my books so much better. And so a good critique group, or a critique partner even. And if you can't find that, and that's difficult to find in your area, then you can always hire a writer's coach that will help you pull that story together before you ever even submit it or put it out there in the world. So those two things are probably, for me, the things that were the most helpful. And when I say critique groups, one of the things I find most interesting is many of the writers I know who write for children do not show their early drafts to children. It doesn't occur to them to do so. And with all of my books, I had child beta readers. In the beginning, it was my own children, and they would read the chapters and tell me what parts were good and what parts were boring, and then I could fix that. And after my kids got older, it was neighbor kids and, the son of a friend, and they in the age group that I'm writing for. And their critiques are probably the most helpful because they're the ones who are going to be reading the books. So yeah, do that too.
Right. That is such good advice. Okay, good. And then just in general, what would be your top tip to help children's book authors succeed?
Well, it's a challenging place right now, the publishing industry. So I always say you got to practice the 3 Ps, which is practice, lots and lots of practice on your writing, and lots of rough drafts, and lots of research, and lots of learning how to write. And then persistence, because it takes longer now to hear back from agents, from editors. If you self-publish your book, that's a longer process because people are, having to wait longer to access editors or layout people. And then the last one is patience. And patience with the fact that sometimes it's not your first book that takes off. Sometimes it's your second or third book. Patience with yourself as you try to figure out the process, patience with your characters because they can sometimes be ornery and not cooperate with you. So there's a lot of patience involved in being a writer. And the people who do those 3 things are the ones that make it the longest. And, I've been doing this for 30 years. And I can tell you that most of my friends that are still here, we still have to adhere to that practice, patience, persistence.
Wow, that is really good advice. Thank you. And then you have a freebie for our audience. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, it's called the Quick Fiction Checklist. And it's on my website. And it's just going to walk you through, do you have a good beginning? Are you setting up your scenes correctly? Is your dialogue doing the 3 most important things that dialogue should do, which is establish character, mood, and move the story forward? And so it just kind of walks you through very quickly before you send out your story, whether it's a short story or a book. You can just check and see, did I do all these things to make my fiction the best it could be?
That's awesome. Thank you. So the link for that will be under the video so people can go grab that. And really, you've given a fantastic insight into a niche that I think a lot of people have possibly never given any thought to. So I hope a lot of people will be like, wow, I want to give this a shot. And thank you so much for sharing all your hard-won expertise.
Thank you. And thank you for the support and help you are providing writers to learn how to write. So that's awesome.
Thank you.